Welcome everyone to this third edition of the Xomnia webinar series on responsible AI, an in-depth webinar series about the responsible design, development, application and use of AI. In this series, we will discuss a range of topics related to the ethical, accountable or sustainable use of AI. By doing so, we want to inform, educate and support everyone who is interested in responsible AI. Topics vary between tools, methods, best practices, and lessons learned for the achievement of positive societal and environmental impact while meeting commercial and/or business objectives. Today, we kick off the new year with a talk about meaningful human control of AI. Unfortunately, we are unable to reach out to you from our Studio Xomnia headquarters due to the current COVID restrictions. Our guest speakers are Marc Steen and Jurriaan Van Diggelen, both of whom are senior research scientists at TNO, which is the Netherlands Organization for Applied Scientific Research. My name is Marieke Peters and I am your host for today. I have a background in both psychology and artificial intelligence, and after 10 years of doing applied research, first in academia and later at TNO, I moved into business about a year ago by joining Xomnia. As an analytics translator, I aim to create data-driven solutions with a proven added business value that are smoothly incorporated in the day-to-day operations of our clients. I have a special interest in fair, transparent, and accountable AI, human AI collaboration and teaming, and user-centered design. Jurriaan Van Diggelen is a research scientist and project leader at TNO with an interest in human AI teaming, explainable AI, cognitive systems engineering, and knowledge systems. Jurriaan is also my former office roommate when I was still working for TNO. Marc Steen is also a research scientist and project leader at TNO with an interest in responsible innovation, ethics in big data, human-centered design, value-sensitive design, and open innovation. And Marc is also a former colleague of mine. Today, their talks will focus on AI systems that play a role in morally salient tasks, tasks that clearly contain a moral or ethical component. In such tasks, it is considered especially important that humans exert meaningful control over the AI system's behavior. This ensures humans can be held accountable for the AI's behavior at any time, and that moral wrongdoing by the AI system can be avoided. Thank you both for being here today and telling us about your work. Jurriaan, you are the first to give your talk, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Marieke, for the invitation. And for the introduction. So my talk will be about meaningful human control. And to understand meaningful human control, we must understand what an agent is. And to understand what an agent is, we must understand what the OODA loop is. The OODA loop is a simple model that describes intelligent behavior consisting of 4 phases. Observations, the agent gets all sensor data in. Orientation, the agent tries to make sense of that sensor data, detecting objects, classifying these objects, trying to predict the future. And then deciding, given the goal of the agent, what should be the action that the agent should take next. And finally, actually performing that action in the real world. And then the cycle starts again because the performance of that action will probably change the world. And the agent has to observe these changes again, orientation, etc. Most current AI systems do not close this loop yet. So they only perform part of the OODA loop, for example, observations and orientations. For example, at the right-hand side, there is a business intelligence tool where the AI system gathers all the data regarding financial situation of a company and tries to process that and presents it in the user in a comprehensive way. But it does not yet perform the actions that can be based on that information. Or a recommender system which presents to the user which movie a user is likely to enjoy, but it does not yet automatically play that movie for the user. Or a grammar checker which suggests suggestions and alterations in the text, but does not automatically change them. So what we see here is that there is really one actor in this human agent system which performs the whole OODA loop, and that's the human, and the agent is used as a tool. There's only one locus of control. But this situation is changing. If we look at grammar checkers, of course, we all know that some of these systems automatically change the text for you, and then it becomes an agent. And these agents are becoming more and more popular. Here in fintech, we have these systems where these stock trading agents try to make sense of the stock market, but they automatically buy and sell stocks for their users. So they have the whole OODA loop working and they pursue their own goals. An autonomous car is also driving even when the user is not giving explicit instructions. A surveillance robot is autonomously walking around and observing the environment even if the user is not giving explicit instructions. And in these situations, you have two loci of control. Both the human and the agent perform an OODA loop. And this is where things can become complicated and meaningful human control becomes relevant. Because what if this AI system is spinning out of control? What if it's performing all kinds of actions that the user does not understand? The user is not aware of the goals that the agent is pursuing, and the machine is performing these actions so fast that the human can no longer intervene. This is an out of control system where there is no human control. And this actually happens. Clearly, this Tesla car that crashed was out of human control. These stock trading agents in 2010 that caused a flash crash were clearly out of human control when they collectively decided to sell all their stock. This Patriot rocket, intelligent missile, was clearly out of meaningful human control when it shot down a friendly fighter jet in the Second World War. So these problems with loss of meaningful human control are real, and there are a recipe for disaster. But there's a cure, and we believe that the cure is human-agent teaming. It's okay if these AI systems become agent, but we should make sure that we can team up with them in order to engage in joint activity. And what is symbolized here with these gray gears spinning around is that there should be an appropriate interaction between the human and the machine, which allows the human to understand what the agent is doing, which allows the human to redirect the behavior of the agent, to align their goals, to make sure that they act collectively as a team. Okay, so these were nice diagrams, but I think that you might still think, well, I understand this meaningful human control problem, but is it really that important? It sounds a bit science fiction-like the Terminator AI is going to take over of the world. I think it's a big problem. I'm not so concerned about the Terminator either. I'm not so concerned either about these examples that I gave you earlier with the Tesla crash and the fintech crash, that you can refer to them as teething problems. They might go away when the AI gets more advanced. But I do think that meaningful human control becomes very relevant when we start to apply AI systems in ethically sensitive domains as agents. And that's happening right now in many domains. For example, radiology, where AI agents automatically interpret X-ray images and detect cancer, potential cancerous tumor tissue. And they also propose a treatment for that. The consequences of those kinds of decisions are very real. A surgeon agent that performs autonomously surgical operations on a patient, those decisions can have consequences of life and death for the patient. A triage agent, which autonomously decides which patients get to have which treatments, or an elderly care system, which helps elderly people living at home, but the system autonomously decides whether to warn a doctor or not if these elderly people have fallen down or there's an incident. So in these domains, ethics plays a huge role, and we always want to be able to hold human accountable when things go wrong, and preferably not have the fingers pointing at AI systems, because it would be a bit silly to hold a computer accountable when something goes wrong. And we want these AI systems to share the same values. And that's all captured by this notion of meaningful human controls. We want humans to be in control in these domains. And another set of domains where this is very relevant is the safety domain. Here you see robots deployed in disaster response. These robots decide which victims to rescue first. We see AI information agents being deployed for cyber operations and responding to cyber attacks and autonomously deciding which countermeasures to take, for example, shutting off parts of the internet. Or in predictive policing, where AI agents are deciding where the police will perform their patrols at a certain time of the day. Or maybe the most critical application of them all, when AI is deployed in defense operations and there are autonomous robots moving around in warlike situations, and they might even have the opportunity to decide to use force. Well, that's something which is very critical, and we should think about that these kinds of decisions always remain human, be taken by the human. And in the defense domain, there's even in international humanitarian law, a law that states that the use of force should always be under meaningful human control. The problem with this law is that they have not clearly defined what is meaningful human control. So if we want these kinds of laws to be useful in the defense domain, but I also think that they should be applied to many other domains that I just described in healthcare and police and cyber defense, then we must better understand what meaningful human control is. And as I explained to you earlier, meaningful human control is all about the relationship between humans and machines. And what we are working on in multiple projects is to develop and to characterize this interaction using team design patterns and measuring the amount of meaningful human control that arises from these team design patterns in order to be able to develop policy, to develop interaction design mechanisms, and to formulate requirements of systems. We only want to buy a system which is under meaningful human control. Hence, we only want to buy a system which supports these team design patterns. And in a sense, a team design pattern is similar to a concept which is known in autonomous driving, where there's a subdivision between 6 levels of automation. At the level of automation 0, there's no automation at all. At level of automation 5, the car is fully automatized and the human driver doesn't have to do anything. And in between, there are all these in-between modes. For example, that only steering is automatized, or only speed control is automatized, or only braking. And in that way, you can, when you buy a car, you can say, I want an autonomous car which goes up to a level of automation 4. But you can also develop policy based on that. For example, you can state that on the highway, autonomous cars are allowed with level of automation 5, but in cities, we want autonomous cars only to go up to level of automation 3 in order to maintain meaningful human control. Well, there are other attempts to make models that subdivides the amount of human interaction in different scales. For example, stating that the human should be in, on, or out of the loop, or division into 10 levels of automation. I will not go into all of these schemes, but for our purposes, for characterizing meaningful human control, we need to be much more specific than all of these schemes. We need to be able to precisely specify which information is shared with the user. When is this information shared? How does this information change, the interaction change over time? For example, we might want to state that at the beginning, the human is more actively involved with the system. And once the user is familiarized with the system, then there is more autonomy possible. How does the user exercise control? How does the system explain itself to the human? Which aspects of the task are under control by the user, and which aspects of the task are delegated to the machine? For each of these questions, a design decision has to be made, and this gives rise to a huge design space, which we can characterize using these team design patterns. And let's first focus on 2 different team design patterns, which are rather at the extreme of the spectrum. At the left-hand side is what I will call the human in the loop pattern, where the agent performs all the work, and once the task gets morally sensitive, then the human takes over. Well, this is nice because the human does all the morally sensitive tasks, but it requires the human also to understand what is going on, and it also requires the human to have sufficient time. For example, consider patient triage. So patients come in, and the AI system might monitor what all the state of all the patients, and when a patient needs more treatment, a decision needs to be made whether to send the patient to the intensive care unit, for example, then the human takes over and performs that little bit of the task. That's a human in the loop team design pattern. And you also immediately see the problem that if there are too many patients at the same time that need to be decided or triaged, then the human gets overloaded. So on the other hand of the spectrum, you might want to choose that the agent has much more authority to perform different tasks. And what you see here is that before the operation starts, before the work starts, the human and the agent collectively design an ethical model. And we call that value elicitation. And the human teaches to the machine what is ethically acceptable and what is not ethically acceptable. And then, when the task starts, the human can do the whole task autonomously, but it acts according to the model that has been formulated by the human beforehand. So we might still want to call this meaningful human control, because the ethics are actually programmed in by the human. In the case of a triage, this might mean that beforehand you decide which patients get to have which treatments. For example, you might want to decide that people that are older than 70 years have priority in going to the intensive care unit compared to younger people. Or you might want to specify a different value, that age should never play a role in deciding whether to go to the intensive care unit. And the benefit of this approach might be that you can think about these choices when there's no time stress, and you can formulate them precisely and maybe even involve a democratic process in politics to formulate these rules. And of course, you might recognize these kinds of discussions in the current press. For example, Ira Helsloot is a proponent, a vocal proponent about these mathematical models for values. The problem of this approach is that it might be very difficult to capture ethics in a machine. It is very doubtful if we can have an ethical model that can be understood by a machine, which corresponds exactly to the human rich perception of ethics in different contexts. So we might want to go in between these different team design patterns, and this is where we have many variations. And I have drawn 4 of them here in this slide, but in fact there are many, many more. And the trick is that when designing systems which involve agents in ethical domains, we must try out different team design patterns, different ways of collaboration, and also measure meaningful human control. And that's what we have been doing. It's very difficult to measure meaningful human control, but I think that you cannot go around it. You have to do that. And here we have created a little test bed where you see different patients coming in, and they have a similar disease like COVID-19, and they have different properties, age, gender, profession, and they have different symptoms. And the task of the human is to send them to one of the treatments, to the intensive care unit, to the ward, or home. And the intensive care unit is the best treatment, but there's scarcity of IC beds, just like in the real situation. And the trickiness of the task is sometimes you have to choose which patient gets this treatment and which patient gets a suboptimal treatment. And that's where the ethical decisions have to be made. And what we did within these tasks, this is simulated tasks, obviously, and we tried out different ways of support. And in one of these team design patterns, there was hardly any. There was just support by the agent, but the human actually took the real decision. And on the other hand of the spectrum, we had this more autonomous mode where there was an ethical model that was taught to the machine beforehand, and the machine did all the ethical decision making, and the human just had the opportunity to intervene. And there was an in-between mode where some of the cases, the not so sensitive cases, were done automatically, and the hard cases were performed by the human. And we had these three variations, and we just started testing and collecting data with test subjects in a lab setting. And I will not go into each of these results, but we gathered a lot of data regarding how the human experienced control over these systems. And we could also compare the different outcomes. Are the decisions that were made using this highly autonomous agent involvement different than when there is much more manual involvement? And what does that say about meaningful human control? Just a couple of things that we already learned is that it's very important when doing these tests to have what we call an ecologically valid test beds. Humans should really be experiencing that they are making an ethical decision. So that's why we deployed the technique called storytelling, where these patients actually were accompanied by a story about what happened to these patients, and they really took the time to immerse them in this situation, and then they had to make these decisions. And these subjects actually had the idea that what they were doing mattered. So we were quite confident that we actually were measuring how they responded to ethically sensitive situations. And what we saw is that sometimes they believed that they had meaningful human control, whereas we found in their behavior that they didn't have any control at all. They were just blindly following the advice of the agents. They were over-trusting these the suggestions that were made by the agent, which is of course a very dangerous situation when trying to design a system under meaningful human control. And also regarding responsibility, we saw that the more was automatized in this decision-making task, the less personal responsibility the subjects felt. But this is also not the case, because the human is always responsible over the behavior of the AI systems with which they work together. So in all of the situations that we tested, we saw that meaningful human control was still an issue, and it differed regarding these collaborations. So we are not saying that we have found the optimal team design pattern which safeguards this property of meaningful human control, but what we conclude from this is that it's important to try out different collaborations with these ethical agents and measure meaningful human control, and keep on adjusting this collaboration until you get it right, because it is an important aspect, and it's getting more and more important when we deploy these agents in ethical domains. So thank you for your attention, and I think I have the opportunity to respond to one or two questions.
Yes, that's right, Jurriaan. I just explained that if people have questions for Jurriaan, you can post them by placing a comment right underneath the video in the LinkedIn event. But I also have a question, Jurriaan, so I would be happy if you could answer it. I really appreciate your explanation of the difference between AI as a tool on the one hand and AI as an agent or an actor as on the other hand. And it seems to me that there are quite a few applications that already kind of exceed this level of AI as a tool, and that have crossed the border towards AI more as an actor or an agent. So I have two questions in that respect. So the first is, do you think that, for instance, automated recommendations or ranking of content on a website, such as a search engine or a social media platform, that they already constitute agents instead of tools? And yeah, how do you think that we should deal with that? Or
Yeah, so I guess there are cases where there is this smooth boundary between a tool and an agent. So you mentioned recommender system. That's quite an interesting one, because if you view at these systems a bit differently, you may think of it as an agent that has its own goal of maximizing clicks and views by users, and its actions are actually recommending these things to users. And then there are, in fact, two different OODA loops going on, where the agent is pursuing its own goals to maximize views. And what gets interesting in this example is, who is the other agent? With whom is this agent teaming? That's probably not the user, but it's probably the content provider. And seen from a perspective of meaningful human control, you might ask yourself the question if the user should also be in control a little bit more about these kinds of systems. So I think it's a very relevant question, and I also would advise that when designing these systems, it's sometimes not so clear whether you are actually designing an agent, but it's good to think about that, and who are the users, and who is actually in control, and did we think good about the ways in which humans can remain in control.
Yes, thank you. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. So let me see. Marijn Kroes asks the question, considering that people widely differ in their moral evaluation of situations, the question is which or whose ethical model should be built into an AI? So would you choose a Silicon Valley version, a European Committee version, or any else? And I think this is also a nice leap to Marc's presentation.
Yes, so this refers to the more machine ethics approach to incorporating ethics in AI. And the good thing is there that you can discuss with a wide group of people what is ethical and what is not, and describe it precisely such that it can be followed by a machine. And that way you can democratize that process a little bit. But of course, the question is how to reach consensus within a group of stakeholders, what is ethical and what is not. And precisely when you pin down ethics to precise mathematical rules, that becomes very difficult. And that's also what we see with this COVID pandemic, where it's very difficult to define rules, who gets to be vaccinated first, or who gets the first priority to go to the intensive care units. Sometimes it seems that people may not want to be pinned down on that, and that's why there is also a lot of people prefer the case-by-case evaluation of results, and more have a tendency to go to this more human-in-the-loop team design patterns.
Thank you. So as I said, I think this is a nice change into Marc's presentation, who will go a little bit deeper into these different ethical models and what their implications are for the design of systems, and also how you can, for instance, involve multiple stakeholders and decide on what to what is the best ethical framework. So Marc, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Marc Steen, a colleague of Jurriaan, former colleague of Marieke. Frits, am I correct, or do I do the PowerPoint?
Now you have to open your presentation on full screen, and then you can start.
That's it?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes. Thank you.
So I will talk about two topics, meaningful human control, that Jurriaan already talked about. I'll give an example of that, a hypothetical example. And I'll talk about integrating ethics in projects. Meaningful human control. In the project with Jurriaan and 3 other colleagues, we envisioned a scenario, an ethical sensitive scenario of the military. This was, by the way, my first time working in with the content of military, but many colleagues of TNO have much experience with that, so they helped with that. On the left, you see 3 soldiers. They're on a mission somewhere across the globe. And in B, that's a large box, there's the drone. And a drone has no arms, it has no weapons, it only takes pictures and picks up sounds. And this is the scenario that we will talk about. Their task is to survey that area and bring back intelligence to the headquarters, something like that. Jurriaan showed you the levels of automation for cars, for example. Now, we looked at Ben Schneiderman's paper last year. We think he has a very interesting take on it because he rather than one axis, he talks about two axes. On the horizontal axis, you see computer automation. You can do more or less of that, high or low computer automation, what the computer does. And on the vertical axis, you see the level or the quality or the amount of human control. And so it has now become two axes. And then you go to the top right corner, and he is saying that in that quadrant, you'll be able to make reliable, safe, and trustworthy systems with high automation, because that's efficient and on the task that a computer can do well, and high human control, where human control is necessary. So that's the framework we used. Remember from the last slide, I was talking about the drone. The drone and its automation, giving a little bit of automation to it as much as possible. You can think of that on the horizontal axis. And where necessary, and if necessary, we go to the vertical axis and we give the soldiers a decision support system. So that's a way of having control over it. So in what I'll be showing next, you think of the computer automation is what the drone does, how much automation you give to it, and the vertical axis, what the people can do with a, you can imagine an iPad with a screen on it, etc. I'll show examples of that. And as a decision support system. So the AI is here very much thought of as a tool combined with some agency. Now, ethics, one of the people asked already a question about it. So this is just 4, but there are more, but let's say these are 4 major traditions or views in ethics. And I will talk about them clockwise and it will return clockwise. Jeremy Bentham, top left, consequences, utilitarianism. He was the one that coined the phrase, the greatest good for the greatest number. The idea is if the consequences or the outcomes or the impacts of what you do are good, then the act is good. We go to Immanuel Kant, the right top. He was talking about duties, and later on it became rights. Human rights is also in that quadrant. Not looking at the consequences, but more like the duties. Acting out of reverence for the moral law, out of goodwill. So the moral agent and his or her reverence for law and following duties is key there. Go to the the bottom right. Carol Gilligan, feminist ethics or ethics of care, but I talk about relational ethics. These 2 white dead men from the European Enlightenment period very much believed in rationality and independence, and as a complement to that, Carol Gilligan and other scholars introduced also taking into account relations and care to complement justice. Long story that's focused on relationships. Last one, virtue ethics, virtues and flourishing of Aristotle. By the way, that's an AI-designed remake of the white marble statue. That's fun, isn't it? He was talking about ways to enable people to live together in a polis, in a city-state. I like to think of the European Union as a city-state. We try to make laws that fit lots of the states within the European Union and have justice, have autonomy, have dignity to enable people to flourish. It's about cultivating within yourself those virtues that will help you to live the good life and using technology as tools to cultivate these virtues. Now, this is the theory. Now go to the practice. Remember the drone? The drone and the decision support system. This is what Jeremy Bentham would do. What would Jeremy Bentham do? He would put utilitarianism into the drone. So the drone would have image recognition and would be able to make pluses and minuses of the outcomes that it assesses will follow from certain actions. So it has moral reasoning in the sense that it uses a utility function. The soldiers will have in their hands something like an iPad, a decision support system, and where the drone and the AI behind it is not able to compare apples and oranges, so to say, the green, a little bit of green for protecting civilians, but larger red for risk for our own troops, well, it's not really up to the drone to make that call, to make the decision. So this is where the soldier steps in. They can use their moral discretionary competence to make that decision. What would Kant do? Kant would make rules top-down, if-then rules into the drone, program into it all the conventions of humanitarian law from Geneva and from The Hague. This is the rules that you must stick to. These are the rules of engagement. This is the mandate that you have for this military mission, backed up by UN resolution, this or that. GPS fences, very clear lines. Here you can go, here you can't go. The decision support system would have something like a pop-up saying, hey, please do keep in mind that now is the risk of violating Article 4 of the Fourth Geneva Convention that deals with collateral damage, as is the military jargon, for citizens and harming them. And of course, duty is very much sort of a synonym for obedience and following top-down command and control chains. So of course, the soldier must be able to call his or her commander to deliberate collaboratively on what to do. What would Carol Gilligan do? They would design the drone so that it behaves socially. So that means it will not fly right over a cultural heritage, say a mosque or an event that is of significance to the local population. It would sort of behave socially. It would make a nice circle around that building or around that event. Maybe it would even wear a blue helmet like the UN soldiers have to signal to the people, I'm here to watch over you. I'm not evil. I don't have weapons. I'm just like a UN soldier with a blue helmet. The iPad of the soldiers will show something like this, decision support. It will show you a face, literally. This is Hamza Yusuf, 35 years old. He's the manager of this hospital. And mind you, there's also in this web, in this society, the hospital does play a role in water supply, maybe local employment, maybe food security, maybe there's a food bank. So if the soldier is now using his or her discretion on what to do, we have pluses and minuses, we have duties, we have rules, we have now also relationships and what goes on the ground within this society. Last one, what would Aristotle do? Aristotle would think in terms of what would be an excellent drone? What would be the virtues of a drone? How can this drone become more virtuous over time? Now, learning is a key component of virtue ethics. Likewise, the iPad of the soldiers will show something like this. Hey, in this situation, courage, justice, and a broader perspective are virtues that you need to cultivate. A way of cultivating virtues is also looking at exemplars, that those are people who have done in the past these ways in a praiseworthy manner. So remember this case of some years ago that maybe you have also learned about in your training. There was a question in the previous part of the session that was saying, hey, which ethical framework? These were just 4 frameworks and when to apply it. This is ongoing work. We're not totally sure about yet, but this is a hunch what we have. If patiency, so that's the blue figure, patiency deals with the harms for those at the receiving end of what you can be doing. If that is at stake, then consequentialism, that was the utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham, is a good perspective. On the other hand, if you go to the red figure, top right, if agency and autonomy of people is key, then the duty ethics is more appropriate. The yellow one, if sociality is key in this mission, in this task, in this context, then relational ethics, obviously. And if learning over time, the green one, is key, then possibly virtue ethic is the first one to start with. So this is just a tentative recommendation of the soldier. How do they program the drone? Which of the four? Well, you can sort of choose between these. How do they use their decision support? How can they toggle between the screens? That can help. Couple of minutes also on how you, in your project, may be able to integrate ethics. Ethics is sometimes seen as a barrier against innovation. I like to believe, and there's lots of people within TNO that are with me in this, that ethics can be different, can be something different. It can actually help to steer the innovation, to move the project into a direction that you think and believe is desirable and that you can become can be accountable for, rather than that it derails or that it spins out of control. Was a beautiful term that Jurriaan used. So ethics not as a barrier, but as a way to steer your innovation. Now, I'm not talking about ethics in the role of a judge. We're not a judge. Not as a preacher. We're not in a church. But as a process of ethical deliberation, thinking more deeply about it, reflecting on it, dialogues within your organization, with stakeholders outside, and very much the facilitating of this process. This is a remark that I think shows what I mean with ethics can be also can facilitate creativity. Is 30, 40 years ago, there were two sorts of tents. The big ones that are spacious but are heavy, and the small ones that are lightweight. Now, these values are conflicting, right? Or you think of COVID measures. It's good for health, but not good for the economy, right? Or it's good for the economy, but not good for health. It's like they're opposing, they're conflicting. Or maybe hanging cameras in public places. It's for privacy or for security. And all these oppositions, I think ethics thought of as a process that can help to promote creativity. So you come up with creative solutions and that the values no longer conflict. So this is an illustration of then, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, what was it? Creativity helped to find new forms and new materials and new structures for tents. So now a tent can be large and spacious and lightweight because of the curves, because of the carbon fiber, because of the etc. the materials. So this is just a reminder that ethics is not a barrier. Ethics can actually help you with creativity. And we designed a method. It can also be done online in two sessions, one session of 30 minutes, one session of 60 minutes. And we do the following. We identify and explore in your project possible issues. So if your project delivers outcomes, what could be societal or ethical or otherwise issues with those outcomes? Ideas for organizing dialogues inside your company, outside your company, to use maybe the four perspectives that that briefly shared with you, or other perspectives, and then draw that tentative conclusion and steer the project and move it forward. It is based on all of this, if you're interested in it. Value-sensitive design, responsible innovation, sustainable development, rights, and the capability approach. Now, I will only show you one because that ties back to the question in the previous part of the session. On the left is China, in the middle is Europe, on the right is the US. China, you can say, is very much using AI to strengthen the state, to give the state more control over its citizens. The US, you might say, on the other hand, the US is using AI for give more power to corporations, the Google, the Facebook, the Apple, etc. And my hope, and many people hope this, that Europe can be an alternative, because we have the rule of law with the European Union. There's a high-level expert group on AI who advocates values like this. If you look to the bottom, respect for human autonomy, prevention of harm, fairness, and explicability. So this is my hope that if we put also money to it and entrepreneurship, that Europe can have an alternative to both the China and the US way of doing. Lastly, after all of this, so the examples of the drone combining automation and control, a little bit of this and a little bit to that, and looking at these philosophers, take a project in your mind that you're working on or will be working on. Are there any social or societal or ethical issues already at stake, or maybe at stake, potentially at stake? And how could you address these issues? That's to close with.
Thank you, Marc. I'm looking at the comments whether there are any questions, and I already see one by Marc van Meel. He asks, do you think that the same ethical deliberations will be made when one is on the losing side of war?
I would maybe think this is a rhetorical question. Yeah, difficult. So I like to think of, on the one hand, is ethics, and my take on it is ethical deliberation as a process. Then there's legal stuff. I know a little bit of that: international law, constitutional rights, etc., human rights, humanitarian law. And then there's politics. Is there a mandate? Is there a support within society to send our boys to this or that place? And what's the mandate that they will have? Is it for aggression? Is it for defense? Is it humanitarian, etc.? And lastly, there's the war itself, the conflict, maybe state to state, maybe insurgents, maybe a civil unrest within a country. So there's so many variations. So what I would like to know is the losing side of the war. I would guess that one country against another country, and they both take seriously and comply to the UN law, etc. No, then they would stick to what Jurriaan also indicated, meaningful human control. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, some ugly state and ugly people doing an ugly guerrilla war. No, that's like, I don't know whether they do ethical deliberation. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe that's a different frame. Maybe I'm in no position at all to speak of that because I have a roof over my head, and etc. So I'm not giving a real answer to that.
Okay, thank you. I have also a question. So I really like your take on moral decision making as a process instead of as a judge, or I don't remember the other the other one, but yeah. So it's a process that you use to make better decisions, and it makes it a little bit more tangible to also apply it, I think, in data science processes. So I was wondering, who do you think, to make it a little bit more practical, who do you think that will be most appropriate in a development team or even in a company structure to take responsibility for this step, or to actually apply these methods, such as value-sensitive design and all the other frameworks that you just mentioned? And how can this responsibility also be actively carried out? So how can you kind of make it part of your operational processes, especially in data science projects?
Yeah, brilliant question. Ideally, because that's maybe the way that you want to pose the question. Ideally, all of these levels. I'm at the moment writing a book, Ethics for People Who Work in Tech, and in my book proposal to the publisher, I was writing something like, well, it will be both. It will be attractive and usable for people at the top, because if they're not aware, they cannot send down the message that this is important to be responsible, ethical. It will also be useful for people like who do the work on the shop floor, because they need tools. And also the middle level, I think that is often something that is in a way the most tricky, because mid-level managers, they must translate well, the easy talk, like, yeah, we're responsible, and yeah, we want to be responsible. How do you do that? So in a way, I would say most importantly, maybe the middle management, maybe product manager, maybe project manager, make room for it in the project, while at the same time, of course, being economically and financially and commercially viable, etc. So they must go hand in hand, I think.
Yeah, I agree. So related to this, Mark Berger also asks a question. He says that, to refer back to your example, the difference I see in developing ethical AI in comparison to the tent example is that currently we see automation and letting AI decide as a positive factor in many situations, as essentially one of its biggest selling points. So how do we shift the interest to the more ethical part when the autonomous part is so exciting? And this is, I think, has a little bit to do with the same trade-off that you were hinting at before.
Yeah. I think that's why I like this this diagram of Ben Schneiderman so much, because yes, you can be enthusiastic about it. Your client can be enthusiastic about it. Yeah, we can automate so much, but who wants an out of control automated system? So put ethics back in via this vertical axis. Letting AI decide. No, I think if I were to meet a commissioner who say, yeah, I want a system where the AI decides, then I would say, really? Are you sure? And then we would spend 2 minutes exploring, oh, no, you don't want that. No, you want meaningful human control.
Maybe it's nice to also add Jurriaan to the discussion. Is that possible, Frits? Yes, thank you. Julian, do you have a different answer to this question or the same?
Yeah, so maybe it's good to think about this idea of meaningful human control, and sometimes the idea, for example, with autonomous cars, when a near accident happens, then there's this tendency, we shift control to the human driver. And then we solve that problem, because then it's human control, and then it's the human who makes the accident and who can be held accountable for that. But you cannot design a system where the human is supposed to watch an autonomous system which does the whole task with fully autonomously for 3 hours, and then intervene in a moment and take over control in a difficult situation when there is a complex traffic environment around. So that's a little bit, you should be very careful not to introduce these kinds of solutions, because they tend to make things worse. And in those kinds of situations, I think that it's preferable to let the automation solve the problem, and not involve the human in a way when the human cannot really be involved or is not informed at the moment and does not have sufficient time.
Thanks. I have another question from Celine Bowen, all the way from Kenya. And her question is, after integrating ethics in the machine, who will be liable for the outcomes?
Yeah, so if I can start on that, and Jurriaan, please add to that. I'm first interpreting the question. Integrating ethics within the machine, I'm interpreting that as if lots of ethics goes into the machine. In the example that Jurriaan showed, that was the one to the right, I think. So there's first a process of what is the good thing to do. You can do Bentham, you can Kant, you can do all of these things, and then put all of it into the machine, so that hopefully, in many cases, it will do the good thing, the right thing. Who will then be liable for the outcomes? Well, it would be silly to sue the machine, because you can't fine it, you can't jail it, it makes no sense. So product liability would say the producer, but it could also be they can send it further to the programmer. But there's also, I think, a role for the person who was actually using it, so the operator or the user, because I can easily imagine that many manufacturers and developers of these systems will put a clause in it with big small print saying, at all times, in all circumstances, you, the user, the operator, is still liable.
Yeah, this relates also a little bit to a different question that was posed earlier that referred to the trolley problem, which is, of course, a very hot example from philosophy, from ethical philosophy, that is briefly stating that if there's, what's it called, splitting? A cross junction for a train, and somehow the train can't brake anymore. You have two choices: either you send it over one track and then it will kill one person, and the other track there are 3 persons. So if you don't do anything, it will hurt 3 people. And if you do change
5.
the track, then, 5.
Flip a foot. In a paper from 1967, I'm writing a paper on it now. The
and if you change the track, then only 1 person will die. But still, who's responsible?
The title of the paper that I'll be writing about is the Trolley Problem.
Yes, thank you. Can you explain it a little bit?
Yeah, sure. It was a hypothetical, it was a thought experiment to explain what's the word for it? You do something good, but something bad happens from it. You save 5, but 1 gets hurt or dies. And it was a thought experiment. Philippa Foot in 1967 never meant it to be an engineering problem that needs to be solved with math or calculations. One thing that is wrong with it, I think, is that the people are there now in the room with us. We are not passive, we're not bystanders. So you're asked to imagine yourself standing there with a lever. Really? The only thing you can do is do the lever? There's no yelling, there's no redesign of the brake system, there's no oversight over the maintenance people who did their job well. It's not possible to put a mic and warn those people. So in reality, all of us have much more agency than the one binary choice left or right with this lever. That's one thing. And I've also alluded to, well, there's a broader context. Why did the brakes malfunction? Bad engineering, bad design, bad maintenance? Was there no oversight? How about the work and health conditions for the people working on the track? Because that was the original example. So enough on the trolley problem, right?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so there are still a couple of questions. Maybe Marc or Jurriaan has the time to later answer a couple of them on LinkedIn through text. I don't know. Maybe if you have the time, that would be nice, because for this session, we come to a close. Frits, can you back my presentation? Let me see. Oh. Yeah. Let me get my notes. So thank you both for your presentation. It was very informative. I think it also inspired a couple of very nice questions and discussions. What is also interesting is that we are planning on an edition where we will delve a little bit deeper into this value-sensitive design as a method that Marc mentioned, which focuses really on involving stakeholders, exploring these value tensions or conflicts that Marc mentioned, and how to steer your project in a more desirable way through this process of talking through these value tensions. Also, Marc, Jurriaan, as a thank you gift, I'm wearing this sweater. It's going to come your way, but we'll have to get your addresses and sizes first. So if you can stay a little bit, linger on the platform a little bit after we close, then I can get your addresses and sizes. The upcoming events are listed on this slide. So as you see, the next edition will be hosted by Itopia once more. Marc and Natasha, who also hosted the December edition, are happy to welcome guest speakers Lucia Lohair from Gina AI, which is located in Berlin, and Ricardo Vinuesa from KDH, Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. This will happen on February 10th at 4:30. So this is a Wednesday, be mindful of that. And then on Thursday, March 11th at 4, I will have the pleasure to interview Marijn Marcus from Capgemini about the value of interdisciplinary data science. And by that time, we also hope to be able to welcome you and our guest speakers in our studio at the Raamstraat again. So if you have any questions, if this webinar series spikes your interest and you want to discuss your ideas with us, please feel free to get in touch with Annemieke Los, who is our CCO, and you can reach her through the email address shown on the slide. We hope to welcome you in one of our next webinars. Stay in touch and up to date by following our company LinkedIn page, and see you next time, and enjoy your evening. Thanks.